a generation of kids who are capable of learning a new language. When there's a phenomena that we experience it, and then we go to a place where we try to describe it, and then we try to explain it, and then we exploit it. And that's sort of the parsimony of Western culture. And I felt like our culture was so strong in explaining and exploiting form. And so as a creative person, I wanted to go back to the early part of that ontogeny and look at experience and early observation and description. And for me, ZOOB is a way to go back and think about how things come into being. Sort of it's a constant way to exercise sort of a meditation on emergence. Thinking about, well, what would happen if? When I was developing artificial life programs, one of the things I started to realize was I wasn't as interested in the potential of the cutting edge technology as much as I was in the problems of that ontogeny of information. That when you go back and you first have an experience and you're observing it, there's clearly some type of bias that you have in your own filter and how you're taking that in. And I felt like watching the behavior of information on an order of magnitude of complexity that was close to natural systems in these emergent learning programs, these artificial life programs, I started thinking about the history of discovery and looking at people like Leeuwenhoek who are looking at cells for the first time, or people like Kepler looking at stars for the first time, or Linnaeus trying to categorize different types of organisms, or Audubon collecting different samples. And the process of going through that descriptive process and naming to explaining something in terms of taking that on. And I feel like there's always some problems in that ontogeny of information, the biases that we find. And I've always been interested in the scientists and discoverers and sort of some of the slippery slope that's taken as they start to create their narrative. Whether it's science or art, there's always a narrative that is part of the cultural bias of the time. And so for me, that was very, very interesting to be able to think about that aspect of that ontogeny. I grew up in Southern California, where I would spend my weekends going to the La Brea tar pits, where there's this big tar pit where fossils were in the middle of LA and Wilshire Boulevard, right next to the LA County Museum. And for me, that idea of this duration, these bones, which were kind of like the nature of what I thought of as ZOOB as, to begin with, these bones, branches, bricks, and bonds, were able to sort of recapitulate their development for us to understand that idea of both duration. And then also I spent my time going to the Museum of Science and Industry, where Charles and Ray Eames had their Mathematica exhibit, and I was very deeply, profoundly moved by the powers of 10 and the idea of going from the body out to the macrocosmic in space, and then back down to the body, and then back into the microcosmic space, and that all these areas were areas that we were now engaged in, and our consciousness was part of. And I felt like I wanted to go back and look at and create in a way that went back to issues of the art of observation, the art of description, and thinking about the possibilities for all these different realms that were, for me, it's always been the macrocosmic, the microcosmic, information space, and the body. And for me, ZOOB was a way of communicating those behaviors that could eventually, on a very on the level of their primitives. So these are just the primitives of the way in which those systems work. One of the things I found very fascinating was that the children who had autism, or on the spectrum, were very quickly had body empathy with ZOOB, where they might not have that kind of relationship with their mirror neurons with people or other things. And there was something about how it extended their body that was very interesting. And so I started realizing that there was a huge epidemic of people who had these neuroatypical problems. And coming from a culture of artists, started to realize that a lot of those sensory integration issues were pretty common to a lot of my artistic friends, but who had learned to turn those things into creative ways of expressing themselves. And so I started thinking about the way that the toy the toy world had changed really dramatically during the period of time that I started to make ZOOB. And kids were less and less playing with hands-on toys, and they were playing much more with electronics, with video games. They were starting to use computers, cell phones, etc. And so the time period where they were exposed to toys is very short, as well as the time of the year that people play with toys is very short. You know, it's like 6 weeks during the Christmas season that people are actually involved in sort of, you know, toy purchases and sort of what it is to play with. So I started thinking about the idea that kids were spending all this time, you know, both the history of television, cinema, through to video games, etc. There's something about the nature of these systems that I felt had a very fundamental effect on the way in which we synchronize to media, to the frequencies of media. So I started looking at some of the primitives, the same I looked at the primitives of ZOOB as the way that living systems work, this living geometry. I started thinking about some of those qualities electronically of the frequencies, the frame rate, the aspects of what synesthesia could be, about indexes of sound and color, and the way that it synchronizes with, you know, all types of body signals, and started developing computational films that have to do with those relationships, coming out of the idea of ZOOB as a system of these fundamental geometric primitives that take on these relational behaviors.